Academic Standard Philosophy course. Hi everyone! So, we learned the idea of human rights, don't we? Modernization has spread it all over the world with the spirit of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
That is the upside-down myth. In fact, modernization has oppressed human rights.
What does it mean?
As society became more integrated through nation-states and global exchange, the Industrial Revolution bound people with a strict middle-class morality. At the same time, those who fell outside this norm were discriminated against as non-human. So, many humanitarians had to fight that mass totalitarianism for them.
I see. Activists are also thinkers, more than couch philosophers.
The UK had a parliament early on, but even in the House of Commons, voting rights were limited to the traditional gentry, who made up just 3% of the population. In France, although a popular uprising led to the revolution, the new government granted voting rights only to high taxpayers. On the other hand, in the US, the big landowners had voting rights. By either measure, many were excluded from politics.
Ancient Rome granted citizenship based on military service, but modern countries have a variety of criteria for citizenship. That meant it was arbitrary, without an absolute reason.
Even before the revolutionary period, the Industrial Revolution had disrupted the self-sufficient lifestyle of rural farmers, forcing many to migrate to cities. This oversupply of labor kept wages low, leading to widespread poverty. The Napoleonic Wars conscripted many men from the countryside, and increased the female workers. But afterwards, demobilized soldiers no longer returned home, instead they stayed in cities. As a result, under the restorative Vienna system, 10% of each country's population was concentrated in its capital city. Low wages and mechanization made the bourgeoisie richer, but these also worsened urban poverty. Men were angry at women and machines, saying they were taking their jobs.
The veterans were probably all macho guys who looked down on women.
Prussia, which had suffered during the Napoleonic Wars, followed Humboldt's advice, and introduced compulsory primary education, as early as 1807, to improve soldiers. Owen had long believed that education was the key to alleviating poverty and increasing productivity, and he built schools for workers in his new Lanark factory in 1816. Comte also advocated social improvement through industry, and hoped that the École Polytechnique would train the technocrats who would lead this movement. However, the education of bourgeois girls to become good wives and wise mothers to secure good marriages had been a priority since the early modern period. Also in the US, Dorothea Dix, a granddaughter of a wealthy family, tried to teach poor children in Boston.
The quality of people determines the quality of society.
As factories grew in size with the introduction of the steam engine and manufacturing machinery, simple labor was no longer sufficient, and businesses could no longer be run by the bourgeoisie, who simply invested their money. Therefore, it became necessary to hire managers, professional engineers, and skilled workers to maintain and operate the machinery factory. Although they were workers, they were well paid, and formed the new middle class. Additionally, coal and steel were beyond the bourgeoisie's personal investment. However, the Industrial Revolution and military expansion were urgent priorities for the states, so they promoted many middle-class men to bureaucratic positions. In turn, the middle-class bureaucrats extended the suffrage, not only to men of the bourgeoisie, but also to the men of the middle class themselves.
Here had come the age of the middle class.
The middle class had not only intelligence, but also respectability, high self-control morality. They adhered to a uniform lifestyle, which was symbolized by their pocket watches. They believed that people should aspire to the same ideal lifestyles as they did. Imitating the bourgeoisie, they also demanded that their wives devote themselves to keeping the house neat, without holding jobs, and encouraged their children to pursue higher education.
Along with them, the modern idea of humanity and gender roles was solidified.
Although the life of the middle class was too rigid, men dreamed of escaping the lower and joining the middle class, like Hugo's Jan Valjean, Balzac's Old Goriot, and Dumas's Monte Cristo. However, just as Dickens depicted in Oliver Twist, the lives of the lower class in reality were only getting worse. On the other hand, women like George Sand emerged, who rebelled against middle-class morality, and lived with a free spirit. Interestingly, the middle-class morality conformed to the traditional Jewish way of life. As the stale Christian discrimination weakened, Jewish men studied hard and rose to success, not only as bankers, but also as bureaucrats, lawyers, doctors, and professors, while Jewish women stayed home and had many children. Eventually, they formed the ruling class in economics, politics, and culture.
From the Napoleonic Wars onwards, no country was able to cover the enormous cost of war without relying on Jewish international finance.
Although isolated, the Quakers maintained their faith, and continued to settle Pennsylvania, starting in Philadelphia, crossing the Appalachian Mountains, and reaching the Great Lakes. They had no uniform dogma, but acted based on spices, simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship. They restored peace with the native Indians, and became their trading agents. Once the U.S. gained independence, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania first rejected slavery in 1780. Free states expanded to the east and the west, however, no one except the Quakers recognized Indians as humans. Meanwhile, Napoleon reinstated black slavery in 1802, to expand French dominance in Africa and the Caribbean, although it had been abolished during the Revolution. In response, the UK passed the Slave Trade Act, to ban it, in 1807, and attacked French slave ships.
Human rights depended on the political expediency.
Tecumseh of Ohio organized the Native Confederacy, which allied with the British Canadian Army, to procure rifles and gunpowder. Finally in 1812, waged the Native Defensive War, against the invading Americans. However, they were defeated, and could do nothing but accept a peaceful takeover. The Southern Five Tribes inevitably adapted to white culture. Nevertheless, Southern American immigrants, prospering from cotton, tobacco, and sugar with black slaves, wanted to expand into their territories, and the U.S. unilaterally passed the Indian Removal Act, in 1830. Although the five tribes did not belong to the U.S., they were forced to relocate to desolate alternative inland areas in the West, by the act. The route was called the Trail of Tears.
To the Americans, it was probably just a way to drive wild animals into the mountains.
Since ancient times, doctors were only physicians, while surgery was looked down upon, as dirty work. Nurses were furthermore seen as vicious drunk lowly women, who did little to care, but took high fees. As the Catholic monasteries in villages which had housed even the weak decreased, the lower clergy in towns had to take on responsibility for the welfare of the parish, as deacons, while in Protestantism, this task was undertaken by someone within the congregation. Owen planned to build the village of New Harmony, as a cooperative and mutual aid community, but it collapsed after just 2 years. However, influenced by his humanism, Annabella Milbanke, who had devoted poet Byron, built a school for boys in West London, with cooperative trusts, in 1834. The aim was to develop character, and equip students with the ability to work and live independently.
They could no longer rely on monasteries, and had to seek to solve their problems themselves.
Revolutionary France conquered the Netherlands, so the UK invaded a Dutch colony, South Africa. However, it was complicated. The Dutchmen ran plantations of sugarcane using black slaves, but the white women would not come from Europe. Therefore, they brought maids from Indonesia, another Dutch colony. As a result, many of the local people were the mixtures, known as Afrikaners. They disliked the UK's ban on slavery, and moved inland, taking their slaves with them. In turn, many British people came, and called servants and workers from British-ruled India.
This would eventually become a source of conflict.
Like Mill at the East India Company, strict middle-class morality and the competition for promotion, had driven many people to mental breakdowns, with strong distilled alcoholic beverages, mass-produced by the industries. Dorothea Dix, who had worked hard to educate poor children, also became mentally depressed herself, shocked by the delay in psychiatric care, and set out to improve the treatment of the patients. A pastor in Dusseldorf, Theodor Flidner, along with his wife Friederike, recognized the need for professional deacons, similar to pastors. In 1836, they founded a deaconess seminary, to train women in serving children, the elderly, and the sick.
Modernism made people ill. They needed the professional carers.
Sophia Auld in Baltimore City taught a black slave boy, Frederick Douglass, secretly from her husband. However, in 1831, a black prophet in Virginia, Nat Turner, led an armed uprising. He and the participants were to be torn to pieces, but even a lot of the innocent blacks were rather massacred in retaliation. Although Sophia Auld also had to stop teaching, Douglass became self-taught. Finally in 1838, he ran away from the plantation, and became an emancipation activist. Southern cotton plantations were making huge profits from exports to the UK. This sparked protests in the UK, because it threatened India's cotton. The World Anti-Slavery Convention was held in London in 1840. Although women humanitarians such as Annabella Milbanke also came and tried to join in, they were not allowed to speak.
The whites were too selfish, enslaving and freeing the blacks for their convenience.
In the north, supported by the UK, a coalition of Teruaki or Sauk tribes launched an attack in 1832, to reclaim territory east of the Mississippi, that the Americans had stolen. The young Lincoln, the son of a poor pioneer, participated in this defense. After that, he became a politician and lawyer in Illinois, through hard work and self-study. In the South, the Americans seized Texas from Mexico. However, it was the buffalo hunting grounds of the nomadic native Numanoa, or Comanche. Riding horses acquired from the Spanish, they had built a vast empire of tens of thousands of people. They fiercely resisted settler encroachments, and sometimes even kidnapped and enslaved the whites. Anne Parker, abducted at age 8 in 1836, became one of the wives of the tribal chief.
It must have been quite frightening for the whites, who had enslaved the blacks, to be enslaved by Indians, whom they considered more savage than themselves.
Lincoln's political arguments were mediocre, focusing on expanding suffrage and developing canals, and his lawsuits were primarily related to railway development. However, he took on the defense of a black woman, in 1841. Illinois had been a free state since 1818, but she was born in 1813, and treated as a slave, as ever. He won the case, and established the precedent, that, all people are free, at least in Illinois. At the same time, the Pennsylvanian Quakers extended the Underground Railroad, in cooperation with other religious groups in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, from the new territories, that the Southern Americans had taken over from the native Indians. It was a secret society, that transported the fugitive blacks, to a safe location in Pennsylvania.
I wonder why they did not save the native Indians.
A Calvinist businessman in Ohio, Owen Brown, was the most enthusiastic abolitionist station master of the Underground Railroad. His son John in Pennsylvania was a road surveyor and a real postmaster, so effective in the activity. The lawyer Lincoln in Illinois also defended the fugitives and those who harbored them. Harriet Tubman in Maryland escaped and became an armed conductor with a gun and a sword, guarding and transporting the fugitive. So she was called Moses. Frederick Douglass also published his autobiography himself in 1845, and campaigned in many free cities, furthermore in the UK. People were amazed that he was writing books and giving speeches, despite being a black. Frederick Douglass also met John Brown in 1847, but he was appalled by Brown's plan for militant emancipation.
At that time in Europe, Bakunin and Marx also planned an armed revolution.
George Williams, who worked at a clothing store, was a devout Christian, and was troubled by the sight of young people of his own lower class, turning to evil and crime. In 1844, he and fellow Christians from various denominations formed the YMCA. It aimed to improve the lives of young people, through volunteering and recreation. The movement expanded worldwide at once. It eventually invented popular games for the young, such as volleyball and basketball. A Baptist evangelist, Thomas Cook, also worked for temperance, planning group tours to the London Great Exhibition of 1851, with cheap stagecoaches and night trains, and urging people to quit drinking and save money. Those were huge successes, and he expanded this no-drinking business overseas.
What moved people was not preaching, but entertainment.
Obstetricians were also not highly regarded. Actually, the maternal mortality rate was higher in hospital births than in those with town midwives. A Hungarian obstetrician at Vienna Hospital, Ignaz Semmelweis, suspected the dead particles in the hospital, and disinfection reduced mothers' deaths dramatically in 1847. However, physicians considered his hypothesis just as a cult. In addition, the Hungarian uprising against the Austrian Empire by the revolutions of 1848 led to Semmelweis' expulsion from Vienna Hospital.
It didn't sound scientific that hospitals were cursed by the dead.
Against the Underground Railroads to Pennsylvania, Southern states forced the U.S. to enact the Fugitive Slave Law, arresting and extraditing them as criminals in 1850. Angered by it, the wife of a Calvinist professor of Bible studies, Harriet Stowe, who had grown up in Ohio, began serializing a sentimental but spectacular entertainment ensemble drama, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in a weekly abolitionist newspaper in 1851. It was a story centered on 3 black slaves, the devout Tom, the fighting George, and Eliza rescuing her child, and was full of biblical motifs of Jesus, Moses, and Maria. It was published as a book in 1852, and sold like hotcakes. Public libraries, which became widespread at that time, increased the readers many times over. Also in Europe, notable authors such as Dickens, George Sand, Heine, and Tolstoy, all praised her book. However, the South countered, citing Abraham, Noah, and Paul, that the Bible supports slavery.
Dumas had already pioneered the newspaper serial novels for the masses. She made good use of the format for her propaganda.
At the same time, a well-educated daughter of the British nobility, Florence Nightingale, wanted to be a nurse, and studied the latest hygiene and patient care at the Flidner Deaconess Seminary in Dusseldorf, in 1851. In 1853, she was asked to rebuild the failing old single governance asylum in London. Her mother was vehemently opposed to a lady's working, especially as a dirty nurse, but her father generously supported her work, with his own money.
I hear that the ladies of the fallen nobles were unable to marry and instead became governants in the new bourgeois families. However, they would have no property and nowhere to go after retirement.
In the aftermath of the 1848 revolution, the Slavic Montenegrin Autonomous Territory in the Balkans sought independence, sparking conflict with the Ottoman rulers. Russia supported it, so France and the UK invaded the Russian Navy base in Crimea, directly in 1854, which escalated into an international war. The French mobilized 300,000 troops, and the UK also sent 100,000, but the fortress was strong, and they suffered heavy casualties. However, in fact, most of the deaths occurred in army hospitals, further back in the line. The scandal prompted Queen Victoria to send Nightingale there. She reduced deaths in army hospitals to less than 10%.
For the government, the excessive lower-class men were expendable. However, the scandal could make the common people bring down the government.
In 1857, the professor at Lille University, Pasteur, clarified that decay and fermentation are caused by microorganisms. Finally, the effectiveness of Semmelweis and Nightingale's sanitary disinfection, which had been treated as occult magic in medicine, had been scientifically proven. Although Karl Furiow, a professor of pathology at Berlin University, had previously rejected Semmelweis' ideas, he became a politician, and promoted public health through initiatives, such as clean water supply and sewerage.
At last, theory had caught up with practice.
Once independence was established, and the native Indians were driven out, the Democratic Party, which emphasized local autonomy, gained the upper hand in the U.S. In addition, people rushed to California on the West Coast for gold. Since 1849, transportation to the Midwest had already been established. So, the question was, which was to build a transcontinental railroad across the Rocky Mountains, the north route from Illinois, or the south route from Texas. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois divided the western Badlands full of valleys into the north Nebraska and the south Kansas in 1854, creating room for slavery as their own option to attract investment in railroads.
In the rugged inland north, a transcontinental railroad was a matter of life or death.
However, that made Kansas bleeding. The sheriff of Kansas attacked and destroyed the abolitionist newspaper offices in 1856. The next day, when a senator of Massachusetts criticized Senator Douglas of Illinois, a representative of South Carolina whipped him almost to death in Congress, like a slave. 2 days later, John Brown and his company killed 5 pro-slavery activists in Kansas, and thus, their war began. At the time, Dred Scott was arguing before the Supreme Court. He was from the free state of Illinois, but worked in the slave state of Missouri. He sought freedom, but was denied, so he sued. The Supreme Court's 1857 conclusion was that a black is not an American citizen, so he had no right to sue. However, the war in Kansas, even with the Supreme Court's discriminatory ruling, failed to rouse Southern slaves to action, and John Brown was executed in 1859 for America's first treason.
It was true that the blacks were neither voluntary immigrants who came for the American independence cause nor the descendants. To avoid the issue that divided the nation, the Supreme Court treated them as a sort of foreigners. Actually, the UK at the time supported the independence of nations in South America and Africa to oppose Spanish and French colonial rule. For the same, it planned to return the blacks to Africa. However, to the abolitionists, the Supreme Court's judge was nothing but a denial of the human rights of the blacks.
In Texas, war continued between the native Namanua and the American settlers. When the Americans raided a village in 1860, they found Ann Parker, who had been abducted 24 years earlier. She was brought back to the settler territory, but she was not very happy. On the other hand, in Illinois, Senator Douglas was overwhelmingly strong. Lincoln challenged him several times, but was no match. However, in the 1860 presidential election, he had 2 other opponents besides Douglas. The split of opponents' votes, and the leverage of the US-complex electoral college system, surprisingly led to Lincoln's win.
He was an indomitable man, but his victory was almost a fluke.
Naturally, those against him challenged the election results. When Lincoln became president in 1861, the Southerners seceded from the U.S. and formed the Confederate States of America. It was not only because they feared that abolition would put a halt to their business, but also because to them, Republican Lincoln was a dictator, denying the root principles of the new continent: independence, self-defense, and local autonomy, which enabled the coexistence of diversity of various minorities, who had been expelled from Europe. So, they began attacking the US, rather as a war of liberation.
In a war, both sides have reasons to fight.
But the North had little reason to fight. Although to those in the West, slavery might be on the horizon, to those in the East, it was a problem in other faraway states. President Lincoln tried to encourage slave rebellions in the South, with the Emancipation Proclamation, in 1863, but meanwhile, he had to impose conscription in the North, due to a lack of volunteers, which rather led to riots against the U.S. Army. On the other hand, Harriet Tubman, who was a conductor of the Underground Railroad, became active at once, as a scout and a commander. Dr. Mary Walker volunteered for the North, and was active in Ohio, as a female surgeon in a male uniform. Many other women dressed as men, also served in the North Army. Dorothea Dix worked as the superintendent of the 3,000 North Army nurses. Although Clara Barton was a clerk, she volunteered as a nurse, and willingly went to the battlefield, to treat the wounded.
To free the slaves, Lincoln introduced a new slavery, conscription. Meanwhile, some women saw the war as a chance to liberate themselves.
However, Dorothea Dix's insistence that wounded soldiers, whichever of the North or of the South, should be treated equally, brought her into conflict, and she left the North Army, and established the Women's Central Association of Relief. A banker in Genova, Henri Dunant, was an international activist of the YMCA. Revering Nightingale, he helped the wounded during the Second Italian War of Independence in 1859, and founded the International Red Cross, in 1863. The American Civil War continued to ebb and flow, for a while, but the North's industrial and railroad capacity, and the South's lack of unity, eventually gave the North an advantage. With 1 million dead, and Lincoln's assassination, the war ended in 1865.
They were the ones who understood Lincoln's humanist ideals.
The blacks in the South were freed, and the black males were even granted the right to vote, but they weren't very pleased. They had no means of earning a living independently, so they had no choice but to become low-wage laborers, on their former plantations. In addition, new Jim Crow laws were enacted in the southern states, completely excluding the blacks, even those from the North. As well, women, both black and white, were denied the right to vote as ever, and remained outside politics.
Jim Crow was a character on a show that makes fun of the blacks. In the end, the war solved nothing.
It conversely made things worse. Homosexuality was just a matter of individuals, so the South had even male prostitutes. However, the Protestant North Army began to punish gay soldiers for discipline. Despite her distinguished service to the North Army, Dr. Mary Walker was arrested multiple times, for wearing men's clothing. The black female scout, Harriet Tubman, too, could not receive a military pension, and suffered from poverty. Henri Dunant, who had founded the International Red Cross, went bankrupt. Postal Inspector, Anthony Comstock was in fact, a fanatic moralist of the New York YMCA, and passed legislation in the U.S. Congress, to exterminate pornography, prostitution, lotteries, birth control, and even women's suffragists, not only from the male, but from society as well. Even in the South, which used to be individualistic, the secret Ku Klux Klan was organized, and attacked not only the rebellious blacks, but also the Northerners in general.
Here came the Savannah Rowers, who tried now to purify the whole U.S.
Karl Furriot at Berlin University was also active in politics, as the liberal leader of the German Progress Party, and opposed the nationalist Chancellor Bismarck. He studied anthropology, denied discrimination against minorities, such as Jews and gays, opposed militarization and colonization, and advocated the establishment of the Federal Europe. However, Bismarck started the Austro-Prussian War in 1866, over the issue of the Austrian enclave in the north, which led to the creation of Greater Germany. He then used the French ambassador's rudeness, as an excuse to instigate the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, which he won, thereby establishing the German Empire. He made homosexuality a criminal offense under paragraph 175, and sought to eliminate it from the nation. In addition, the Greater Germany plan included Catholics in the South and Poland. Furriot cooperated with Bismarck in expelling the influence of the Pope as the Kulturkampf.
Even the enlightened figure was consumed by nationalism.
After the post-war Paris Commune failed in 1871, the idea of an aggressive revolution by the lower class became quite stale. Instead, the pressure of the negative strike, mass absenteeism, forced management to negotiate, which gradually improved the working conditions. In addition, unlike Marx's expectation of the conflict between the two classes of capitalists and workers, workers differentiated from higher top managers to skilled machine operators at various levels. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, and unskilled macho labor was provided by immigrant men without citizenship from Asia and other places. So, if having good skills, such as accounting and typing, even women were welcomed. Especially in medicine, research, and the arts, many women were active, including medical educator Elizabeth Blackwell, pest scientist Eleanor Ormerod, actress Sarah Bernhardt, and physicist Marie Curie.
Delicate management and machinery drove out rough machismo.
An unified army, with conscription, mobilization, and discipline, as well as mass communication through photographs, railroads, and telephones, removed local color from the nations, and made them homogenized. That created a competitive society, where hard-working middle-class respectability, indomitable challenging pioneer success dream, and faithful and obedient wives and children were needed, to move up the social ladder. Under peer pressure, these became the human traditional standard models for all people. Meanwhile, those who fell outside the standard, were considered losers in life.
He was not quite traditional, but fabricated in modern times.
During the American Civil War, Texas settlers joined the South Army, and the conflict with the native Namanua subsided. However, after the war ended, the invasions became even more severe, as savage remnants of the South Army joined in more. The Americans organized even black ex-slave troops, and made them fight against the Indians. On the other hand, the new resistance leader of the native Namanua was, surprisingly, Quanah Parker, the son of N. Parker. However, the Americans fired revolvers indiscriminately, aiming to exterminate them, not only the warriors, but also the women and children. After much suffering, Quanah surrendered to the U.S. in 1875, and Namanua moved to the assigned small settlement. Nevertheless, Quanah became there a successful rancher, dealing with Americans.
The defeated soldiers became the outlaws of the West, plundering, murdering, whatever they wanted.
The growth of the US and the unification of Germany led to global overproduction. The abundance of silver coins in general circulation decreased their value, so since 1873, various countries switched to the international gold standard, which further triggered financial contraction and economic depression. France, burdened by war reparations, was particularly hard hit. Each country turned to protectionism. Grain prices plummeted, leading to a massive exodus of migrants from agricultural countries, such as Italy, Spain, Eastern Europe, and Russia.
These were the sounds of the world creaking as it became more interconnected.
The long depression, combined with constant competition, strict ethics, and comparisons with others, exerted tremendous pressure on people. They suffered from immobility, tantrums, anxiety, insomnia, alcoholism, and sometimes even suicide. The symptoms appeared in particular among middle-class women, who were increasingly confined to the home, and forced to play the role of good wives, mothers, and daughters. Traditionally, it was diagnosed as an organic disease, originating in the uterus, and was named hysteria. They often used cannabis-derived resin, hashish, as a household herb. In the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War, tablets and injections of morphine, the active ingredient in opium, were widely used, as a painkiller for wounded soldiers. However, as resistance developed, the effect diminished. As an alternative, coca wine, made from coca leaves, was popular. Initially, it was believed that it was not addictive. Pemberton, a veteran and a pharmacist in Atlanta, who himself suffered from morphine addiction, and sought help from cocaine, launched Coca-Cola in 1886, as herbal medicinal drink.
The side effects of a new drug are unknown until victims are affected.
The bourgeois Jews active in international finance and culture, became once again the target of hatred, as the cause of the Depression. In 1886, a journalist Trumont, published a massive 1,200-page book, Jewish France, with a list of 3,000 influential Jews by name. He insisted that the cunning and inferior Jews are deceiving the heroic Aryans. This book sold incredibly well. Lesseps, who built the Suez Canal in 1869, and Eiffel, who built the tower in the Paris Exhibition in 1889, planned the Panama Canal. Although the construction was far harder than Suez, Jewish businessmen bribed many politicians, and sold the funds to 800,000 ordinary people. In 1892, the project collapsed, and the bonds became worthless. The fact fueled people's hatred of the Jews.
In the Long Depression, the canal was a hope to come back for ordinary French people.
Dr. Silas Mitchell in Philadelphia believed that the disorders of the American Civil War veterans were due to nerve damage, and treated them with diet and rest. He also applied this treatment to female hysterical patients, with success. However, Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris was the director of a big nursing home that housed as many as 5,000 elderly women. He suspected that hysteria was a functional disorder, and was trying hypnotherapy as a treatment. Learning from him, Dr. Freud published a paper on male hysteria in 1886, opened a practice in Vienna, and prescribed large quantities of the new drug, cocaine. These were met with strong opposition from the medical community. However, based on numerous clinical results, he concluded that the root cause of hysteria was past sexual abuse, and further argued that sexual impulses, libido, were at the root of the unconscious mind.
There was what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. His libido theory was similar to Nietzsche's will to power.
Gandhi, who obtained his law degree in London, started practicing in South Africa in 1893, where many Indian people had settled. However, the discovery of gold and diamonds in the 1860s made many British people rush in, leading to frequent conflicts with the Afrikaners, who were of mixed Dutch and Indonesian descent, using black slaves for their plantations. In this chaotic situation, the Indian people were also treated like slaves by the British, as well as even the lawyer Gandhi. He regained his sense of identity as an Indian, and, in order to eliminate discrimination, he persistently continued political negotiations through satyagraha, namely nonviolent resistance, refusing to be defeated by oppression.
His human rights activism was intertwined with nationalism.
The US began to emerge from the Long Depression, as early as the 1880s. The driving force was extraordinary tycoons in railroads, steel, oil, etc., such as Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Rockefeller. They survived in the money game by making full use of cartels, trusts, and concerns. Although they were even mocked as robber barons, they were in fact self-made capitalists who rose from humble beginnings through tireless effort. During the Gilded Age, they flaunted their success with extravagant homes and luxuries, but they also generously donated surplus funds to build universities, hospitals, and cultural facilities named after them.
Extravagant spending alleviated the lack of demand.
Admiring them, people tried to emulate them to achieve success. Various expositions held around the world introduced people to the latest technology and extra luxury goods. New permanent department stores sourced these luxury goods from around the world, making them not only for seeing, but also for buying. There came various mass-produced luxury brands that symbolized a successful life. For example, Louis Vuitton created suitcases that could withstand being piled up during the upper-middle-class mass travel, and promoted them at exhibitions, expanding into the world. Rolex also produced high-class waterproof wristwatches, although the truly wealthy never got their hands wet, and, in the first place, they had no time to keep, but instead forced others to follow them.
Mass-produced luxury goods are a contradiction in terms.
Veblen at Chicago University ironically thought, in the leisure class of 1899, that the wealthy's consumption is a sort of social division of labor, and they do it for the lower classes. Max Weber at Heidelberg University insisted in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism of 1905, that Protestants who considered diligence a sign of faith made capital accumulation possible. However, his friend Sombart at the Berlin School of Commerce countered that it was not the Protestants, but the Jews, excluded from the stable market of guilds, who, through its disruption, created capitalism. He also believed that the quantitative extravagance of the early modern nobles had transformed into a small qualitative luxury of the contemporary city bourgeoisie, which would be pursued endlessly.
Unlike speculative Marxism, their ideas were based on the investigation of history and reality.
Conspicuous consumption quickly saturated the domestic market. However, the small qualitative luxury could be exported easily. So, various countries competed to seize undeveloped colonial markets around the world, encouraging residents to indulge in luxury. In turn, they exploited the resources of those regions. In particular, they scrambled Africa, not procuring slaves, but under the guise of humanitarian aid. They separated the natives into different races based on height, and, considering the tall as closer to the civilized, used them for governance. Furthermore, they sold large quantities of weapons to countries like Japan, Ethiopia, and the Middle East, ostensibly to support independence and reforms, but in reality, they instigated conflicts, burdened those countries with debt, and thereby strengthened their own control.
Humanism was used to justify aggression.
Lenin, a Marxist who had been released from Siberia, went into exile in Switzerland in 1900. He was frustrated by the emergence of nationalism in each country, which unified everyone, from the nouveau riche and hired managers to machine operators. So, he believed that the proletariat without property should be separated from the bourgeoisie globally, by instructing of a third type of intellectual, the professional revolutionary communists, and that the International Communist Party should monopolize and manage capital, in place of the world bourgeoisie. At that time, the young former teacher Mussolini was seeking new employment in Switzerland, and was influenced by Lenin.
The Communist Party that Lenin envisioned was not the community of workers that Marx had conceived.
Having won the Franco-Prussian War and achieved unification, Germany feared that France would retaliate by allying with the advanced UK. So in 1882, it formed the Triple Alliance with Italy and Austria, the former members of the Holy Roman Empire's Greater Germany, to guarantee each other's security. As expected, France also strengthened its relations not only with the UK, but also with Russia, thus encircling Greater Germany. A sci-fi writer in England, H.G. Wells published The War of the Worlds in 1898, in which mysterious aliens suddenly and inexplicably invade Earth. An office worker in Prague, Austria, Kafka also wrote an absurd and nightmarish novel, such as The Trial and the Castle. Swiss psychiatrist Jung was influenced by Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams of 1899, and realized that human beings or nations have in advance the collective unconsciousness that works as archetypes to understand various real experiences. So, he researched myths and the occult.
People sensed that an unreasonable nightmare was coming up.
In 1914, when a Serbian assassinated the Austrian Archduke, and Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia joined the conflict as the same Slavic nation, and France and Britain were also drawn into the war against the Greater Germany. However, due to a border dispute with Austria, Italy switched, while the Ottomans sided with the Greater Germany. H.G. Wells, who had long viewed the Greater Germany as a threat, welcomed this as the war to end war. However, both sides mobilized even their industrial and economic power, resulting in a trench warfare deadlock. Machine guns, poison gas, and aerial bombardment led to a large number of casualties among soldiers, furthermore among civilians.
The Industrial Revolution also gave rise to weapons of mass destruction and transformed ordinary citizens into participants in war.
As welfare capitalism, Henry Ford in the U.S. developed the inexpensive Model T Ford, and paid workers double the average daily wage, enabling them to own their own cars, and thereby generating demand. He attempted to mediate between Europe, and held a conference on a peace ship, carrying influential figures, in 1915. However, many, including the President and Edison, declined to board. Jewish feminist Rosika Schwimmer, who was invited from Hungary, broke the meeting with her arrogance, which led the media to ridicule the plan as a fool ship. Not only did Ford withdraw from the peace movement, but he also began to suspect that the war was all a Jewish conspiracy.
What did she do on that ship to completely reverse the intentions of the well-meaning person?
In war-torn Russia, an accidental revolution led by peasants and soldiers took place in February 1917. However, they were unable to reach a consensus, and the confusion continued. The opposing Greater Germany sent the Russian revolutionary Lenin, who had been living in exile in Switzerland, back to Russia by a sealed train. Russia descended into civil war and dropped out of the European Great War. Meanwhile, the Spanish flu pandemic broke out in Europe, causing both sides to lose fighting power. A revolution also took place in Germany, and eventually the war ended in 1918, with tens of millions of dead.
It was just an attrition between rebellious nations.
After realizing the Indian Relief Act in South Africa in 1914, the lawyer Gandhi returned to India. The UK promised India independence, in exchange for its cooperation in the war. Although 150,000 Indians died in the war, the UK did not keep its promises. Instead, it strengthened its control over India, including through arbitrary arrests. Gandhi declared that India was dead, and called for a nationwide hartal, a strike of mourning, in 1919. The UK tried to suppress this with force, but Gandhi advocated nonviolent resistance, boycotts of British goods, and the promotion of self-sufficiency.
Indeed, nationalism is power, but unification is also a suppression of difference. Eventually, the Muslims will separate from the Hindus.
Eleanor Roosevelt, a wealthy, intelligent, and tall lady in New York, had lost her parents, but was enthusiastic about community volunteer work from a young age. Although she married her relative, politician Franklin Roosevelt, in 1905, his mother was overbearing, and he indulged in infidelity, even with Eleanor's secretary. She considered getting a divorce, but his mother threatened to disinherit her if she did. Although the social advancements that replaced the men who went off to war finally granted women's suffrage in the US, in 1920, the conditions were not yet in place for women to become politicians. Therefore, she decided to realize her political ambitions through her husband. She helped propel her husband to become a vice presidential candidate, but he lost the election. Furthermore, he became confined to a wheelchair due to polio in 1921.
Women still face numerous obstacles when trying to succeed in society.
In Russia, despite being a minority, Lenin overpowered the revolutionary government through armed struggle, and sought to export the revolution worldwide through the Comintern. However, Jewish Marxist Rosa Luxemburg in Germany criticized Lenin's idea of a communist dictatorship. Instead, aiming to establish a government for the proletariat in general, she rose with her Spartacus League in 1919, but they were lynched and murdered by the volunteer militia. Although Lenin defeated the revolutionary government and established a communist dictatorship in Russia, due to the resistance and failure in Germany, his idea of communist world revolution was already in jeopardy, and to make matters worse, famine hit Russia, and he also suffered a stroke. After a fierce power struggle within the party, Stalin, who returned from exile in Siberia, became the sole dictator in 1924.
What Marx was talking about was just the proletariat class dictatorship, as described by Rosa Luxemburg, not the Communist Party dictatorship insisted by Lenin, much less the General Secretary dictatorship practiced by Stalin.
Mussolini, who had volunteered to fight in the war against Austria, founded the Fascist Party after the war. It adopted corporatism, similar to what Lenin advocated, aiming for the party to monopolize and manage capital in place of the bourgeoisie, but it hated international communism. Instead, it insisted on ultranationalism, seeking to reclaim the former territories of the ancient Roman Empire, all over the Mediterranean, as a living space that Italians needed for their survival. He urged women to have more children than blacks and Asians, to increase the nation's power. In 1922, his black shirt militia staged coups in various locations, and he became prime minister. He forcibly unified the nation through propaganda and brutal police, while appeasing them with public works projects and the expansion of invasions.
The ultimate outcome of capitalist competition is the government's victory. However, if so, what is different from communism?
Commoner Hitler could not accept Germany's defeat, because he had fought voluntarily on the front himself, and the forces had never been defeated. He believed in the stab-in-the-back myth of Jewish traitors. In addition, the Greater Germany collapsed, and was burdened with enormous war reparations, under the Treaty of Versailles. Here, resentment towards the stateless wealthy Jews, the poor Eastern Jews, and the revolutionary Jews like Rosa Luxemburg, ignited again people's irrational anti-Semitism. Imitating Mussolini in Italy, Hitler also launched a nationalist movement against Jews and international communism, and staged a coup, along with the swastika flag, that he himself designed. But he failed, and was arrested in 1923.
He could not understand that the outcome of a war is not determined solely by the battles.
Influenced by Nietzsche, a former high school teacher, Spengler already published The Decline of the West in 1918 and 22. He believed that every civilization should decline, leaving behind its culture, as the Faustian West would do. According to him, modern democracy is, in fact, the victory of money, because those who spend more on campaigns can win. But he had predicted that an authoritarian figure, another Caesar, would eventually emerge and destroy it. In contrast, Ortega y Gasset described the modern era as a triumph of mediocrity in the revolt of the masses in 1929. People have lost even middle-class morality without any remorse, and prefer to take direct action, but they are too uniform to reflect themselves in the retrial.
They gave an overview of the modern era, but both were pessimistic, and their predictions, unfortunately, proved accurate with the emergence of Mussolini and Stalin.
The devastation in Europe led to prosperity in the US. The wealthy class who controlled industry reveled in the extravagant pleasures of the Jazz Age. Even ordinary people, such as a shoeshine boy, invested their meager savings in the stock market. Ford and others feared as anti-Semitists, believing that the Jews who had taken over Europe would next invade the US. In 1929, as Europe stabilized, and the Bank of England raised interest rates, funds began to flow out of the US stock market. On Thursday, October 24th, stock prices suddenly plummeted, triggering the world's Great Depression.
When everyone thought the same way, naturally the market became unstable without a balance between buyers and sellers. It was not the Jewish conspiracy.
Schumpeter at Harvard University generalized Sombert's idea of creative destruction, and argued that a dynamic economy, where equilibrium is constantly broken, is rather sound. So, he proposed 3 steps: money creation by banks, disruptive sourcing by entrepreneurs, and innovative combining in the market. However, his friend, Keynes at Cambridge University, pointed out that, nowadays, no bank retains the power to create money, which led to a lack of effective demand and solvency. Despite being separated from her husband in a wheelchair, Franklin, Eleanor Roosevelt encouraged him, and ultimately helped him, get elected as president. She traveled across the US by plane, with a female pilot and a female journalist, conveying the plight of those suffering from the economic depression, to Franklin. Following her advice, President Franklin Roosevelt initiated the New Deal policy, massive government-funded public works projects, as the last consumer with solvency. The newspapers were critical of it, so he spoke directly to the public through radio, known as fireside chats.
His economic policies overturned the laissez-faire principles that had been in place since Adam Smith.
In prison, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, and revised his policy to legitimate action. After his release, he rebuilt the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. His speech was incoherent, but it captivated the people, like a hypnotic spell, and the Great Depression propelled the Nazis to become the second largest party. Hitler came very close to defeating Hindenburg in the 1932 presidential election, so Hindenburg was forced to appoint him as chancellor. When the parliament was set on fire by a communist and closed in 1933, Hitler was granted legislative power without the parliament. When Hindenburg died of old age in 1934, Hitler became a dictatorial Führer. He captivated people with public works projects, and stylishly designed uniforms and architecture.
His thinking was incoherent, but his speeches and designs were brilliant. However, he was nothing but a common phony, only with appearance.
Mussolini disliked Hitler, but decided to cooperate with him, in the face of opposition from the UK and France. Following Mussolini's expansion into the Mediterranean, Hitler also devised a plan to expand Germany's living space, eastward, beyond merely restoring a greater Germany. Unlike Mussolini, it was based not on nationalism, but on bizarre racial supremacy of the Aryans, and discrimination against Jews. However, Poland refused the Jews too. In 1938, a young Polish Jew assassinated a German embassy official, which led to an attack on Jews throughout Germany. The day was called Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. In 1939, Germany attacked Poland, and the Soviet Union also invaded westward. Germany conquered France, and as a result, the UK was drawn into the conflict, which escalated into a world war again.
Accepting exiles and refugees is not a simple matter.
At the same time, Japan, at war against China, also launched an attack on the US, in the Pacific in 1941. Eleanor Roosevelt continuously supported Franklin's long presidency. Rather, everyone already knew that she was the substance of the presidency. Almost all the petitions of the people were addressed to her. She worked diligently to eliminate the Jim Crow laws, which still discriminated against blacks in the South. She was tolerant of homosexuality. Upon hearing about the persecution of Jews in Europe, she also made every effort to help them find refuge. She strongly opposed President Franklin's actions in confining Japanese people in concentration camps in the desert.
Why didn't he intern German American and Italian American citizens?
The Nazis, struggling with the war, could no longer even maintain the deplorable concentration camps, and resorted to the Holocaust, mass murder. On the other hand, Stalin welcomed the Jews, to get the Jewish economic support worldwide. To corner the Nazis from both sides, President Franklin Roosevelt sent enormous aid to Stalin, although he was another dictatorial monster, just like Mussolini and Hitler. In 1943, he had already established the United Nations, as a framework for post-war settlement. In April 1945, Franklin died ill, but the United Nations drove the two to their deaths, bringing the war in Europe to an end. However, despite the disadvantage, Japan never showed any intention of surrendering. So, the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Finally, the emperor ordered the Japanese to end the war.
How many casualties were there on both sides? These were not accidents, but murders of the people by the people, for the people.
A Jewish psychologist at Frankfurt University, Erich Fromm, went into exile in Mexico in 1934. Influenced by Freud, he attempted to explain the rise of Nazism through psychoanalysis in Escape from Freedom in 1941. According to him, although modern times have given people freedom from traditional communities, it was just the emptiness of loneliness and anxiety. To compensate for this, people try to cling to the strong, trample on the weak, and hide among their peers. The Nazis responded to these three needs.
New religion and labor unions in cities are quite similar in this respect.
Jewish Hannah Arendt, who had studied under Heidegger, Husserl, and Jaspers, also had to flee to France in 1933, and furthermore to the US in 1941. In The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, she pointed out that Mussolini, Hitler, and Stalin differed fundamentally from other movements, in that they possessed secret police and concentration camps. It all began with the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution. Brutal totalitarianism fabricates an enemy of humanity, and forces the nation to believe in its own utopia to protect. Under the ideology or the empty worldview, it literally kills individuality.
However, nowadays, every state confines the nation within the land and brainwashes them with mass communication.
The war ended, but the conflict began at once, in the victorious United Nations. Stalin changed his stance, and demanded the return of the Jews. However, not only Germany and Italy, but also the UK and France, were devastated by the war, and did not have such resources available. In the US, there were many staunch anti-Semites, such as Walt Disney, as ever. After all, the UN arrogantly decided to establish the Jewish state of Israel in Arab Palestine, and to cram them there in 1947. Although Eleanor Roosevelt, the US representative to the UN, played a pivotal role in the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and in redefining the UN's role in addressing these issues, the Cold War broke out, and proxy wars erupted across various regions, rendering the UN dysfunctional.
For Stalin, Jews were merely a temporary means of accumulating support. In fact, communism and the Jewish capitalists were incompatible. Much less poor refugees were nothing but a burden.
The suppression of freedom exists not only under dictatorial totalitarianism, but also in more familiar situations. David Reisman at Chicago University examined the burbs, inhabitants of the newly developed residential areas, in the lonely crowd in 1950. There, they can be neither tradition-directed, nor inner-directed, but should be other-directed, to form a new community. Everyone must be mindful of others' feelings, seek others' approval, and set aside one's own desires. C. Wright Mills at Columbia University also researched salespersons in white collar in 1951. They need to get people to buy into them as individuals before they can sell their products or services. For this marketing, they must cultivate approachability and align with their buyers' values.
Voluntarily becoming a slave is the key to getting ahead in modern society.
Even worse, men and women were mobilized for the military and factories during the total war, losing the local color of their hometowns, and becoming engulfed in the trend toward uniformity. For those who could barely read, entertainment consisted of a subculture of graphic magazines, pulp fiction, and cheap movies, which did not require trad-cultural literacy. They were excited by sports games at the stadium, pop songs on the radio, and comedy on television. They were not wealthy, but their accumulation of pennies propelled the entertainment industry into a central part of the economy. Mass-produced electrical appliances and automobiles have improved people's lives in the lower middle class, but have also caused problems, such as waste, pollution, and overcrowding. The expansion of democracy has promoted popular celebrities into politics, who have turned to theatrical populism to gain popularity.
Trends of subculture are updated in an instant, always shaking up and exciting people, but they become stale at once.
Along with this, human marketing is prevalent, and the humanship to participate in society, the criteria of a normal human, become narrow and uniform. Weak human relations in modern society leave many individuals lonely, and they not only succumb to peer pressure themselves, but also anonymously discriminate against the weak and obstruct others' freedom, to gain a sense of belonging to some community. Thus, people form a totalitarianism without a dictator. Even though civil rights had already been granted, they were not followed, so Martin Luther King Jr. had to fight against an invisible foe. On the other hand, some people have gone so far as to unfairly expand their own interests and oppress others by asserting their own human rights. Human rights are not simply rights, but rather an obligation to respect the rights of others. It should end at the feet of others.